Thank you very much. And I'm a little bit disappointed that this afternoon we don't have the walk-up music. I was sort of imagining in my mind a soundtrack to my life, like a little rain cloud floating over my head, following me with like a little soundtrack music. So a little disappointed I don't have that introduction. But nonetheless, a wonderful introduction from Katrine. Thank you very much. And also thank you to the Global Challenges Foundation, the jurists, and especially my co-finalists. You know, it's been really rewarding learning from each of you, and I really think we could use about 3 days together to explore how our work can intersect and we can collaborate to create real systematic change. So I want to start by asking a question, as all good educators do, and by way of responding, if you could just show your hands. How many of you believe that war is inhumane? All right, pretty universal. How many believe that war is immoral? Pretty universal. How many believe that war is an illegitimate means to resolving conflict? Still pretty close to universal. Okay. Okay, then how many of you believe that war, not just the current war or the next war, but the institution of war itself can be abolished? About 3, 4, 5 hands. So this is interesting. Well, I see some very strong hands. I'm very excited to see those in the back. But what I want to point out here is that even amongst many of the anti-war activists and peace scholars, there is this general belief that war itself can't be ended or will never be abolished, right? And so why do we hold on to these beliefs? This is one of the things that I want us to unpack. So part of the answer lies in the mythology surrounding war. We hold a lot of assumptions about the inevitability of war. These myths are pretty easy to debunk with accurate information. So, for instance, many hold the belief that war is, quote unquote, in our genes. It's part of our DNA. It's who we are. It's part of human nature. But in fact, this is a social invention, not a biological trait. Not only is there no scientific evidence of genetic predispositions to war, there is no viable anthropological evidence to suggest that our hunter-gathering ancestors ever engaged in war-making activities, okay? Warfare, you know, one group violently organizing against another with the intent to kill to achieve certain aims has only been around for about 10,000 years. And in the scale of history, that's really only 5% of our existence as Homo sapiens. So that's a very small part of the scale. So part of the educational work of World Beyond War is providing the factual evidence to challenge these claims, these myths. But that alone isn't enough. War, as a means to resolving international conflicts, it's deeply embedded in our thinking. It's immortalized in most of our cultures. It's rooted in a very predominant patriarchal gender order. It's reaffirmed in most cases by formal education, and it's publicly enshrined in military monuments in almost every town square. And in fact, I was just standing over here in the auditorium. We see a plaque here commemorating D-Day in this theater. I would mention, too, if you look at the slide, I found this picture. This is a propaganda poster from Great Britain in World War I. And you can see here how you have the workers seamlessly fusing into the soldiers, you know, as part of the recruitment effort. It's doing part of your duty as part of the normal civic culture, as part of who we are. It's pretty amazing. So we turn to often, or at least I do, anthropologist Margaret Mead, I'm sure most of you are familiar with, to help us challenge this deep-rooted culture. She famously declared that war is not in our genes, that it is in fact a human invention. And this is good news for us, as other human inventions have faded away when 2 basic conditions have been met. First, the defects of the old system have been identified and they're recognized. And second, a new invention is envisioned and designed to replace the old. Now, regarding the first condition, the defects of war are pretty well documented, clearly illustrated by the raising of hands in this room. First and foremost, we know that war kills, is indiscriminate. At least 108 million people were killed in wars in the 20th century. 108 million people. War and preparations for war, they devastate our environment, they harm the planet, and out-of-control military spending diverts resources from meeting human needs. For example, UN research conducted a few years back suggested that it only would take about $30 billion in 1 year, roughly 1.5% of global military spending to eliminate starvation on Earth. Think about that, 1.5% of global military spending. So simply put, militarism and the institution of war, it breeds insecurity. It's the exact opposite of what it purports to do. So we know these defects, but what are we to replace this war system with? And this second condition is really the educational task of what World Beyond War is all about. What new inventions need to be designed to replace this old system? What more preferable, nonviolent alternatives currently exist, which must still be imagined? And once we have a clear vision, how do we go about actually facilitating the transition from the old to the new? What does that look like? And most importantly, what's each of our responsibilities in contributing to this change? So, World Beyond War tackles this in our frequently updated book, A Global Security System, An Alternative to War. This is our educational blueprint for ending all wars. We propose that the path to ending war and establishing an alternative global security system can be achieved through 3 broad and interrelated strategies. Number 1, demilitarizing security. Number 2, managing conflict without violence. And number 3, creating a culture of peace. So, we talked a lot about complexity these last few days. So I want to show you kind of an illustrative map of our system. And you can see here that our vision is very dynamic, it's very complex, it has lots of different moving parts that we want people to begin thinking about. I'm only going to touch on a few of these points here that are most relevant to the educational task at hand. So let's see if I can walk through a couple of these ideas. Our approach to demilitarizing security, first and foremost, requires alleviating our dependence on militarized approaches. But it also requires that we rethink what really makes us secure, right? Rather than understanding security as hiding behind an iron shield, what if we thought of it as freedom from direct violence, from danger, from threat? What if we add to that understanding that to be secure means that we're able to achieve our full human potential, right? Both somatic and psychological. So this would imply that our basic human needs are met, access to food, water, shelter, clothing, healthcare, sanitation, education. And it also implies that we're able to live with human dignity, that we have assurance that our needs to belong and be in community with others is not threatened. I mean, this is the essence of what human security is really about, where people are placed above the interests of the nation state. And so in moving away from this highly militarized nation-state system that we presently have, we explore a lot of transitionary strategies, which you can see here, shifting to a non-provocative defense posture, phasing out foreign military bases, dismantling military alliances, these things that are really offensive in nature in their operation. And we also tackle the deep entrenchment of the military, industrial, corporate, academic complex and explore how we might transition to a peace economy and what that looks like. Now, strategies for managing conflict without violence, these strategies are more focused on reforming or establishing new institutions of global governance and the tools and the processes for assuring security. We start by identifying the weaknesses inherent in the UN system, which is our current institution of global governance, and we especially pick apart its emphasis on collective security through militarized means, and the challenges of obviously overcoming national self-interest and sovereignty. We probe reforms to strengthen UN security functions, as well as possibilities for increasing the effectiveness of international law. And we also look at strategies for greater participation of civil society. For example, how many of you are even aware that there are civilian peacekeeping forces that are working around the world currently in conflict zones, and they're much more effective and less politicized than the UN peacekeeping forces and other efforts. So these efforts show that civilians can step in when governments are found to fail in their duty to provide security. And we also stretch the limits of our thinking here. We propose bold new systems for global governance and encourage new and creative thinking of what that can look like. What could a system look like that is more representative of the people that inhabit these systems, not just the leaders of these nation states? And last, but certainly not least, we look at strategies for nurturing a culture of peace. And these are the most visionary, transformative, and future-oriented within our system. These strategies are concerned with establishing the cultural norms and the values and the principles necessary for sustaining a thriving peace system and the means to spread it globally. Now, of course, we recognize that simply sharing and disseminating this information alone is quite insufficient to the educational task of abolishing the institution of war. So, disarming our minds, as this illustration would suggest, he's picking apart the Pentagon, requires a much more transformative pedagogical approach. And we do this first and foremost by articulating the strategies I've just described to you with clarity. We document the research behind them, we show the data, we illustrate their effectiveness by providing concrete examples of people actually doing the work. We also help elucidate how these components fit together as a system of mutually reinforcing parts. So pursuing action in just one area, just focusing on disarmament, for example, is a fragmented strategy. It's unlikely to lead to sustainable results if we aren't looking at the cultural component that keeps sustaining those attitudes and beliefs. So we seek to articulate this interdependence of these different functions. And of utmost importance to our pedagogical approach, and this is a theme I've heard from many of my co-finalists, we seek to connect the experience of war and these alternative probabilities and possibilities to the lived experience of the learner, right? As long as war remains normative, as long as it's viewed simply as an abstraction, individuals won't be compelled to take action to change it. So the learning must be personal if it's going to become political. So to support learners on this transformative path, we've developed a Study War No More, which is a complementary online learning and discussion guide for our book. And this guide provides guiding inquiries for independent study or for facilitating discussion in classrooms and within community groups. And Study War No More also helps bring out alternative system to life by featuring videos from what we describe as our study and action partners, which you can see listed up here. These are leading global thinkers, strategists, academics, advocates, activists, and others who are already actively engaged in developing alternative components of this new global security system. So while our educational work and tools are based on the knowledge and experience of these and many other experts, our work is really still an evolving plan that will change as we gain more and more experience and insight. So for example, our book right now is in its 4th edition. But these educational tools for us, we consider them really more of an invitation to learners to begin to come join us in this kind of dynamic and growing movement that's working for a world beyond war. And while it's difficult to measure the impact of our work with absolute certainty, we can confidently say that our book has been read by thousands around the world. It's been incorporated into university courses and high schools. It's been utilized by community and faith-based groups for discussion and action planning. It has inspired both local actions and encouraged others to get involved in global movements. The book has been read by elected officials in the US, and it's been endorsed by Nobel Peace Prize laureates. We're about to publish summaries of the books for the first time now in several different languages, and we've just released an audiobook version so you can begin thinking about abolishing war on your morning commute. So let me wrap this up by returning to Margaret Mead once again. She also alluded to a third condition that must be met for an old invention to fade away. We need to believe that social invention itself is possible. So getting past the pessimism that the war system imbues in us, so few hands came up in this room. This is normal. Getting past that pessimism is not an easy task. Futurists are keen to point out that it's difficult to imagine and construct preferred realities when our visions of the future are guided by present probabilities. Right? The present system is so stark that these negative futures seem predestined to us. So when we begin to think about the future as a negative construction, right? So this worldview shapes our thinking about what's possible. So we have to shake off these humanly invented chains of the war system and militarism that shape our thinking if we're to move from probable to preferred future realities. Thinking that war is inevitable makes it so. Thinking that ending war is possible opens the door to constructive work on an actual peace system. And this is the thinking that we hope our work inspires. Thank you.
you.
Thank you for the presentation. I think you have come up with a very ambitious project and chosen a especially difficult problem to tackle, actually. I think I would see myself also a bit on the pessimistic side, what you just said, like it's really hard to get out of that mindset, and I think that approach is really nice to make people aware that you don't have to accept that existing idea of like what security should look like and that we can demand it to be changed. I'm just kind of interested in that one special topic of disarmament that was also on one of your slides, because I think the idea that war is inevitable, we can work on that, but I don't know, what do you think about the disarmament thing, or like have you talked to actually policymakers about this one point, like you can change people's minds, can you actually make policymakers make those decisions? Have you been in contact?
Yeah, I don't know if there's no way you can make anyone do anything, obviously, but I think our strategy is twofold. I mean, I think first and foremost, we want to motivate citizens to apply active pressure upon their governments to make the decisions that represent their interests. I mean, look at the recent UN treaty on nuclear abolition. That effort wasn't led by governments. It was led by global civil society, activists all around the world in the ICANN network, for example. Truly transformational to bring that to a vote within the UN system, and it's still not fully operationalized, but it's on its way. So there's two aspects of it. There's the disarming of the mind and the militarist mindset that we tackle specifically in this educational work. But we do put forward policy recommendations that we think are practical, simple, straightforward things. Our book obviously deals a lot with the U.S. context because we have a very large global military presence that's very offensive in nature. And so we certainly tackle a lot of that in our book, but it's a universal problem. Yeah.
Makes me a little bit less anxious that you are optimistic.
Thank you.
Thank you for a very disarming presentation. So of course it is very attractive what you're proposing, but I guess the feeling that anyone coming into that kind of worldview asks the question, where do I start? I mean, it's so all-encompassing. It's every aspect. How do I, as an individual, where in this system that you have created, should I start?
I mean, I think the fundamental question is the one I began this presentation with. What makes us secure? And when you ask that to an individual, and in the context of looking at the war system in a militarized approach to security, that leaves us really vulnerable and really insecure, the ever-present threat of nuclear annihilation. And you start to ask people in a very personal sense what makes them feel healthy, responsive, and good. It's a sense of belonging in community. It's a sense that your needs are going to be met. When we start to break it down and just change our general thinking about security, the rest begins to follow. That's the experience that I found in my own teaching. Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Thank you.